Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm the moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, lots of really interesting stuff in today's webinar, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question, please go ahead and just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also are going to be doing a drawing at the end of today's webinar for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. You got to be in it to win it. And hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is Modernizing Jenkins CI/CD Pipelines. Our speakers today are Steve Burton, who is the CMO at Harness, Stephen Gregory, who is a Senior Principal SRE at Lessonly, and Chris Jowett, who is the DevOps Architect at ABC Fitness. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Steve, I know you are going to be driving this conversation, so I'll put myself on mute, take myself off camera, and I'll see you guys on the other side. Thank
you. Welcome, everyone. Thought I'd do a quick speaker introduction because we got some fantastic stories to share. You're probably looking at this slide and looking at the webcams and thinking, is that really Chris? I can assure you that's Chris. Chris is a DevOps architect at ABC Fitness. He previously worked at Rackspace, so has a lot of experience in DevOps. Interesting fact, he actually has military intelligence and has a background in bomb, what was it, Chris? Bomb?
It was bomb analysis, like just collecting evidence off of IEDs.
Right. He assures me the reason for his beard is because of the 10 years in DevOps that he's endured, and so that's pretty much his excuse for why the photo looks different on this slide. Anyway, great. Thanks for joining us, Chris. Stephen Gregory, Senior Principal SRE at Lessonly. Stephen previously worked at Oracle. So again, like Chris, has a background in DevOps. Interesting fact, he actually wrote a PHP application that saved someone's life. So
PHP is not all bad, I promise.
Yeah, so PHP scripting, yeah. Myself, I do marketing, but in a former life, I was a software engineer. Working on Java 1.12, I think that was what it was back then, in EJBs, which are not fashionably cool these days, so I'm going to leave it at that. Anyway, purpose of the webinar is to talk about the butler in the room, so let's crack on. So then, guys, why do we need to modernize Jenkins CI/CD pipelines? Chris, do you want to kind of give us your thoughts at a high level? Like, why do you think we need to talk about this?
Yeah, so Jenkins is pretty great for some uses, but it just has a lot of management overhead that you need to take care of, and there's a lot of development time. And if you can afford to trade time for a little bit of cost, then for some organizations that can be really beneficial.
Okay, Stephen, yourself?
Yeah, so I think you can do a lot of things with Jenkins. Obviously, I think Jenkins originally came around for the whole CI portion of the CI/CD pipeline, and people have allowed it to do extra things, but the primitives aren't really there for doing things like getting your code to the final destination. And so, while you can make it happen, I think that having tools in place that are natively designed for that actual delivery portion really is a major benefit.
Okay. And so if we take a pause and think, all right, it's 2021. I almost said 2020 there. It's 2021, and I was using Jenkins back in 2008 when it was called Hudson, when I was an engineer. And so if I'm in your shoes and I'm running a DevOps team or an SRE team, what are the things I should be thinking about start doing and stop doing with regards to my pipelines in Jenkins?
Who did you want to go first?
So I guess I'll start. I think that one of the things that has worked great is the things in the pipeline, making sure that everything is consistent, right? That's the whole point of the continuous integration, making sure that all of your builds are consistent and everything there is working. I think the trick that we've had, the areas where we've had problems are removing flakes, removing some of those things that are less valuable from the pipeline, but then also figuring out what parts are going to change as your team grows and making sure that you can kind of scale those out. And I think that delivering the portion of the pipeline that's actually delivering the software to the production environments has been the part where I've had the most trouble. So really identifying how that delivery happens is kind of a key thing.
So on that point, you think looking forward 6-12 months, what is it? Well, our requirements likely going to be then, and then trying to work backwards from that.
Right. Yes.
Great, thanks. Chris, what about yourself?
So one thing I would recommend is, and a lot of us are Linux people, some of us are Mac people, but that's okay. So we're used to applications that do one thing and do one thing well. So I'd recommend working on making your pipeline be built out of small composable chunks. So you should have like a step that does a thing. That way you can compose those pieces together in different ways and you can reuse them. And that also helps out a lot if you want to transition to a different system. You no longer have to do like an all or nothing transition, because you can move like individual steps from maybe using one test framework to another framework or using one deployment tool to another deployment tool.
Got it. So modularizing reuse. How effective have you seen reuse with Jenkins?
So it depends. We've had some pretty decent luck with reusable pipeline steps, but that's because in our organization we place a lot of constraints on what developers are and are not allowed to do. I frequently use the phrase that we manage boxes, not services. So like we like to be able to put services into a little box and categorize it, and we expect it to work the same way as all of the other services in that box. And only because we're so strict about that do we get a lot of reuse value out of these individual steps that we make. But in an organization where you have a lot of snowflakes, speaking to Steven's point, if you have a lot of snowflakes, then your reusability goes right out the window.
Got it. And what do you think the reason is for that? Like, what intrigues an engineer to create a snowflake versus think reusable components?
I mean, from a software developer standpoint, it's easier to just sit down and write it in a way that you know that you can make it work, as opposed to having to abide by standards.
Right.
But from an overall organization point, I personally don't know of any good reason why an organization would want 10 services that work 10 different ways, as opposed to having maybe 10 services where some of them work one way, like where there's like maybe 3 categories of services. Yeah. It makes everything easier to manage. So from an organizational standpoint, I don't know a good reason why, but as a software developer, it would definitely be easier if I didn't have to follow any rules.
Yeah, and I think some of it too comes about because of independent invention. A bunch of people working in different areas all kind of realize they need the same thing, and it doesn't really look like it's the same thing until you get, a couple months down the line, right? And
yeah,
trying to identify those and correct for that, and for some standardizations, always good.
Great. So with that, Chris, can you walk us through your journey? So like walk us through the beginning with Jenkins, the benefits you had, and then where you ended up today, and what are the key things you've been doing to modernize your Jenkins pipelines?
Yeah, so we've been working on building a new platform to replace some legacy systems, which is probably a boat that a lot of DevOps people find themselves in, is build this new thing to replace the old thing. And while we were doing it, we wanted to limit cost, and so Jenkins was a great option. It's free, but there's you have to just build it yourself, and so that made a lot of sense for us when we were first starting out, because when you're first building the new product, no one is paying for the new product yet. And so if you have no income, you want to keep your expenses to a minimum. As we started to grow in size, and hopefully not grow as much in complexity, but grow in complexity a bit as well, you start to feel some pains of having to maintain all of the everything yourself. And so that's when we started looking into areas that we could free up engineers to have them work on other other tasks that are not so easily shifted off to other systems. And so that's when we started looking at moving away from Jenkins. And that's actually a fairly recent transition for us. I think it was only about a year ago that we got to where Jenkins was just taking up too much of our time. And that's when we started moving things over to Harness, actually. And because of the fact that we had individual pieces that did individual things, and we had a very clear separation between CI and CD, it actually made that transition pretty easy. So that modular approach that I was talking about earlier really helped us out there.
So just on that point, that's interesting. You're one of the few customers that I think keeps CI and CD separate, even though you were using Jenkins. What was, when you look back at that, what was the reason behind it, as opposed to just building a single pipeline that did everything?
So we did technically have a single pipeline that did everything, but because we had individual steps that did one thing and did one thing well, there was a spot in the pipeline where it very clearly shifted from being responsible for building the artifact and putting the artifact somewhere and deploying that artifact. There was a very clear line in the pipeline where it transitioned from CI to CD. So we didn't technically have them separated, but when we moved our CD over to Harness, we basically just got to delete the second 2/3, the latter 2/3 of our pipelines, and leave the first bit there to handle the CI part.
And so you talk about the time being spent previously trying to do everything in Jenkins. Like, can you kind of quantify it a little bit? Like, was it a few hours? Was it a few days?
Yeah. So what Stephen was talking about earlier about there's not a lot of primitives there in Jenkins. I mean, you can extend it with plugins, but because we ran into quite a few issues with bugs and plugins and things like that, it actually took up a pretty decent amount of time. Like at one point we ran into a bug where if you used, so we're running Jenkins pipelines, obviously, if you used a parallel call in a pipeline, then after Jenkins restarted, it would fail to properly resume a previous pipeline. And at that point, like your whole pipeline is just dead and stuck. So we would have a pipeline that would run partway through, deploy into a couple of environments. Jenkins gets restarted for some reason. It's in Kubernetes. It gets restarted all the time. Jenkins gets restarted, and now that pipeline is just dead. And that took us a lot of time to debug that and figure out what was going on, and eventually figure out that it was the call to parallel that made it to where the pipeline couldn't resume properly. I think that bug is now fixed, but that took hours of time for us to figure out. And anytime that we wanted to add a new environment, we had to go in and modify the CD portion of the pipeline to add that environment in, or if we want to get rid of an environment, we had to go in and modify it and take that. It's just not nearly as flexible. You could make it more flexible, but then you're adding even more development time onto it. Like, you can build anything you want. The question is just how much time do you have to actually build it? And because at some point you need to have it actually do work.
Got it. And so the skeptic's going to say, well, why do I need two tools when I can use one? So how would you, like, if you think about how much effort was it to move to another tool? Because we hear that quite a lot from engineers, like, why do I need another tool to do what I already do?
Yeah, and that's a very valid concern. Like, tool sprawl is a problem. You don't want to have 50 tools to deploy a platform that has like 8 microservices, right? So whenever you add another tool into the mix, it needs to be very carefully considered as to whether or not you're going to get a benefit out of the addition of that tool. And to us, we added the complexity of adding another tool because we got what has, for the most part, been a more stable platform and taken up much less of our time. I was talking earlier about adding extra environments. Adding an environment in Harness takes us, maybe at most, like, if you've done it before, maybe 20 minutes to add another environment into our Harness pipelines. In Jenkins, like, it takes a decent bit longer, and it's more error prone because you're basically just going into text files and you're copying and pasting and having to replace certain spots. Like, everyone's done the copy, paste, and find replace maneuver in code before. And so that's a very error prone process. Did you replace all the things that you needed to replace? Well, normally, especially if it's like a higher up environment, you might not find out until something gets far enough down the pipeline to try and deploy into that new environment, and now it doesn't work. Whereas with Harness, we add a new environment, we know it's going to work.
And how long did it take to make that migration? So, like, whenever we talk about modernizing anything, people assume months, years. like especially microservices, monoliths, things like that?
Yeah, so we still have a couple of things that are deployed through Jenkins. We probably have like 95% of our stuff is being deployed through Harness though. And the stuff that we have migrated over to Harness, it really didn't take that long. We had, actually during our POC period, we had a meeting scheduled to like go through and like start bringing our first service over in it. And one of our engineers decided to just go in and play around in it, and like 6 hours later, he had that service deploying just on his own, just because he felt like it. And then we showed up to the next meeting, like, all right, well, let's get one of your first serve. Oh, wait, you already have one in here, you know? So it really did not take that long. And because we shove our services down into little boxes, once we got that one service done, every service in that category was able to be moved over to Harness really quickly and easily, because we already had it all set up. We just had to add the new services and say use same pipeline, and we were good.
Yeah.
So it probably took us a total of a couple weeks to get our like a 1.0 of migrate everything over to Harness done.
Okay. Great. Thanks for sharing. That's Stephen, how does your journey look like at Lessonly?
Yeah. So originally, when I joined Lessonly, the goal was to move off of a platform as a service platform. And so right now, at the beginning, all of our developers just pushing code up, and that does something that causes a build in the platform and deploys the code. So we were missing we had CI running tests. We didn't really have anything that was building artifacts that we could deploy to multiple places, and we needed to start deploying to somewhere other than this platform as a service provider, right? So we're deploying to AWS. We have our own VPC there. So the go-to thing, I've been running Jenkins and Hudson like you since mid 2000s, right? 2005 or 2006, whatever. So my go-to tool for that was Jenkins, because it's easy enough to get running. We got it building, got it installing our services using Helm into a Kubernetes cluster. Kind of developed our new platform, and I'm basically the only person at this point who knows how to use any of this stuff. So I have this entire learning curve for the rest of the team to try to get everybody up to speed. The whole deployment process, which had been a script that people were running, which is probably something you should also stop doing, is having your deployment being a script on somebody's local machine. But we got all of the Jenkins up and running. We realized that it was hard, or I realized there's a lot of maintenance there. Jenkins has a new version every week, right? There's all the plugins. The Helm script that I had in place, it worked, but every time I needed to update an environment variable or change anything, it was a lot of work to get everything working, right? So my next step was to get, I actually tried Spinnaker. Got Spinnaker running, and that was definitely a big step up from using Jenkins as a deployment tool.
Yeah.
But as much as Jenkins is a lot to run, Spinnaker is even more. And it's just a couple of people on my team who are managing all of this stuff, right? So that's where we kind of, from that point, we realized we don't want to be the ones managing all of this infrastructure. And there's some pieces missing for getting all of our team into this tool so that they could be the ones pushing out code and making all these changes. So that's where we ended up with Harness.
You bring up a good point in that when you were building Jenkins and it was all working, only you really understood the mechanics and how it worked. How long would it take someone on your team to onboard and get familiar or kind of learn that basic understanding of how to operate it?
Yeah, it definitely took a couple of days for people to really get, to get a new person inside of the code and looking at how everything's working, the pipeline, and then also getting them to understand how something like Kubernetes is working as well, because they would then have to learn the entire kind of concept of Kubernetes all at once, whereas within Harness right now, we can give some boilerplate stuff for deployments, and they don't really have to know about how a lot of that stuff works, but they can still go in and modify things and be productive pretty quickly without having to understand ingresses and services,
Right, so it gives that abstraction almost.
Yeah.
And what were some of the benefits? So like Chris talked about saving engineering time and the maintenance and just making it more repeatable and modular. What was the big win you think for your team?
So a lot of it has been, much like Chris mentioned, bringing on a new environment. When I had that Jenkins server deploying directly, we had one environment that was kind of a prototype environment because we had a new customer that might be coming onto this environment. Now we've got 3 of those environments, and if we had to bring on another one of those environments, it wouldn't take any time, right?
Yeah.
And doing that, bringing on new services, we have 2 new services that, whereas historically we have been deploying a monolith, we're starting to bring on some new, not microservices, but kind of more individual specific purpose services. And we've been able to just deploy those everywhere.
Right.
We don't have to go through and tweak a script to make sure everything works. It's just we have the definition now, and the same way we deploy everything else, we deploy this new service.
Great, thanks for sharing. So just so I understand, like to summarize, I guess you got 2 options, right? You can keep Jenkins for CI, like I think both of you have done, because the cutoff point is really once you do the build and the test and you've got a package and you've got an artifact, that generally sits in a repo like JFrog or Sonatype or Docker Hub, and then simply then attaching your CD solution to that repo then allows you to distribute it across the different environments. So you can see there, like I think you talked about, you looked at Spinnaker as well. There's lots of other solutions. So it's not like, I know Hannes was mentioned, but there's lots of other tools you can evaluate and look at for your requirements. Number 2, how do you feel about modernizing CI? Like, is Jenkins just run out of time with CI? Is it good enough? How many years do you think it's got left for dev teams to keep using it for CI?
I can go first on that one. I think it really depends on your organization's requirements, and what you're building. Also, there's a lot of organizations where, like, say they're deploying Java. It's super common in the enterprise. They're probably using Gradle or Maven as a build system, and that's going to handle most of your build and test to at least get your jar files going, and then you just basically, for the most part, wrap it up, at least for us, wrap it up into a Docker image and publish it somewhere. And for that use case, like just Jenkins works really good because it's a fairly simplistic use case for CI. But if you want to start doing, there are opportunities to do far more advanced things with your CI, especially with all of the advances in machine learning and stuff like that that's being added into build processes. I mean, could you do that in Jenkins? Maybe. Like, I mean, at this point, I don't know of any Jenkins plugins that do any machine learning stuff, but I'm sure someone will write one eventually. The other question is not can you, it's should you, and like, do you have ML experts on staff and stuff like that? If you're looking to leverage some of that more modern functionality, then yeah, absolutely look at a CI platform that's going to give you that functionality, so you don't have to hire a team of people that help build AlphaGo or something like that, So I think it heavily depends on what your use case is and what you need out of your CI platform, and you're just going to have to look at your requirements and determine what bit of tooling fulfills those requirements at the price point that you want to hit. And so I think it's going to be a very personal decision from organization to organization.
Yeah. I think for us, we've just been running the same thing we've been running for years, and it runs tests, right? It builds stuff. But at the same time, it also takes a really long time. And some of that is because we have tests that we probably aren't worth running anymore, that take a lot of time. And we just, we can either spend the time going through and cleaning out, rewriting all of our tests, and we should probably be maybe deleting them, or maybe there's some better tools there to help us find a better way to run that. There have been some of those on the horizon that we've kind of started to look at. So I'll be more curious about some of that.
Steph, I understand there's advances in how you can optimize the build and test cycles, so you can effectively reduce the size of containers, reduce the test cycle time spent, and be a bit more intelligent on when to run tests and when not to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advantage there.
Cool. Just want to pause there for a second. We'd like this to be interactive, so there'll be a Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions as we go through, I can see a few coming in now. We've got a question from Sandeep. What would be the best practice to set up a highly available Jenkins for VMware infrastructure? So like if you kind of think about like, do you cluster the Jenkins servers? Do you have failovers? Like how have you kind of architected Jenkins CI in the previous?
Yeah, so that's definitely a challenge with Jenkins. Like there are things that you can do. You can look into like pipeline resiliency so that pipelines can be resumed after Jenkins restarts. There are ways that you can run like multiple Jenkins masters, but I've had varying levels of success with all of those ways. Especially like since we run most of our infrastructure in Kubernetes, you have to run on the assumption that every now and then your stuff is going to get restarted. And so we have actually just put a policy on our Jenkins pod, like a pod disruption budget, to tell Kubernetes to like try its best to not restart that pod. And then we run our builds inside of Kubernetes workers, inside of other Kubernetes pods, and the pipelines can be resumed if needed. But we rely for the most part on our pipelines are very short-lived. It runs a build, it finishes, and then if Jenkins restarts, it's not a big deal because there's probably not any pipelines running. But yeah, making a proper HA Jenkins setup is definitely a challenge. Just like anytime you're trying to make a piece of software that was made back in like early 2000s, I think it was, when Jenkins was first made. Man, that makes me feel old. Anytime you're trying to make something like HA and resilient that was built when those were not major concerns in the industry is going to be a challenge. And the way that you achieve that is going to highly depend on your infrastructure and its capabilities.
Got it. Another question for Chris. We hear people use the words toolchain or pipeline. When should you use one or the other? Or do you actually care? What do you call it? Do you call it a toolchain, a pipeline? What's kind of like, how do you describe the CI/CD mechanism?
So for me, a tool chain would be the actual tooling that you're using to do your build. So like for our builds, we have Gradle runs our builds. That's part of our tool chain. SonarQube runs our code quality analysis. That's part of our tool chain. We have Twistlock that runs some static analysis of the code. That's part of our tool chain. And then the pipeline is the code that weaves all of that together to give you your end result. So the tool chain is the specific tools that you're using, and then the pipeline is the code that actually like invokes them and serves, like in old school terms, the pipeline's kind of like a make file, you know?
Yeah. Got it. A question for Stephen. Did you look at any of the solutions from cloud providers like AWS Code Pipeline or any of the native tooling that you get?
Yeah, so that was definitely something we explored a little bit. I think that the AWS provides a platform for building your own platform, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity to build something really great with it, but in the same lines of that you can build out anything with Jenkins, you can build out anything with the code pipeline. The advantage that I liked about Spinnaker, Harness, those types of tools is they're a little bit more opinionated around how things can be done, and that kind of structured the way that the structures that they provide are much more in line with what we're trying to do, as opposed to trying to define our own thing and use code pipeline and code build and all those tools to kind of really get something very specific and very, yeah. So I think that's really the difference there.
Thanks. So we'll leave it there, and we'll catch up on the rest of the questions towards the end of the session. Here's a curveball. I'm sure many Jenkins passionate people are screaming at me saying, why not Jenkins X? So let's discuss Jenkins X. Any thoughts, opinions on Jenkins X?
So I have not spent a lot of time with Jenkins X. When I was bringing up Jenkins, Jenkins X was definitely one of the things I was looking at because I was trying to run Jenkins inside of a cluster. It looked the thing that the downside there seemed to be that a lot of it seemed to be very command line oriented, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But when I was trying to bring on a team that is really oriented, very used to having a GUI, a web interface for doing these things, that was a downside. So trying to not move everybody from this website to these command line tools to.
Yeah. And for us, like I've used Jenkins X a little bit, but for the most part, I found it as being just like a different skin on top of the same old dog, right? So it's like echoing the it's all command line. Like I'm a command line guy. I run Gentoo Linux on my desktop. I'm about as command line as you can get. So I love command line tools. But you know who doesn't love command line tools? People who work on the business side of the house. They need to be able to see things. QA analysts need to be able to see things. Software, you'd be surprised how many software developers are not command line people. Like they have their IDEs and that GUI gives them a lot of assistance. So it's going like way back to the beginning when Steven was talking about it's a tool that only really he and his team knows how to work. Like Jenkins X would be great for me and my team, but now it's a tool that only me and my team know how to work, and that's not useful for the company. And also it didn't fix a lot of the problems with Jenkins of like, we still have to build it and we still have to maintain it and we still have to do the care and feeding. It's just a different animal that we're having to care and feed.
Yeah, got it. Or we got option 4, let's just keep building things. So interesting question. What do you think is the right things DevOps engineers should be building? So obviously you can build anything, but in 2021, what do you think are the right valuable things to build versus potentially look at leveraging or using as a service? So Stephen, I don't know if you want to kind of start and give us your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I think that it's hard to avoid building things that are core to your company, right? What is your company's core competencies? What is it that your company does, right? So Lessonly builds training software, and we have, so we try to integrate with a whole bunch of different things. Inside of a lesson, you might have video, you might have images, all that sort of stuff. We try not to build the actual handling of all that images and videos, but we're finding that that type of stuff we need to bring in, right? We may need to bring in-house more than having it as a third party or as some sort of off-the-shelf solution, because it's so core to what we're doing on a daily basis. Things like getting the software that we built to the production servers, our customers aren't going to see that. Hopefully they will see, if we're doing it right, there will hopefully be a positive impact, because we're not going to be spending all of our time shipping software, running make, tarring up the files, SSHing them off and running install scripts, right? That's not going to help anybody. So anything that we can do to remove that burden on the developers without having to really spend time on it is definitely something that makes sense to not build.
Yeah, I think Chris, you made the analogy of why do we want to build buttons?
Yeah, when we were talking previously, with a pipeline, a well-done pipeline, it's I click a button and my code goes into an environment. If you're doing full CD, then it auto testing deploys the next environment on its own. You have as few gates as possible. But what everyone sees that consumes the CI/CD system is they just see buttons. They click a button and a thing happens. The real magic comes in building that button, right? It's you want it to seem like it's really easy because you want it to be really easy, but in reality, there's a lot of work that goes behind building that button. So, but as far as like, should you keep building buttons? Should you keep building CI/CD pipelines? And the answer is like a lot of things I've said, it depends on your organization's requirements. It especially depends on your funding. If you're a startup and you have very little funding and you're trying to get your business off the ground, there are probably better places for you to spend your very limited funding. Like Stephen was talking about, spending that money on your company's core competency, on your company's core product. Because if you can't get people like consuming your core product, then your business is not going to stay around. And in those cases, you probably should build your own CI/CD pipelines, but that at some point you'll hit this mark where you're spending more and more time on managing and maintaining those CI/CD pipelines, and there's a crossover point on the graph of like how much does this tool cost versus how much does an engineer cost, and then they cross over. And that's the point when the tool is now cheaper than an engineer is, that you should probably look into paying for the tool, because now you don't have to hire another engineer. So that's like and where that point is would vary from company to company.
Yeah.
So,
and then at that point, you can start working on building out things that are, how do we standardize making these services go out so the next time we've got another one, it's easy. We have to think about it.
Yeah, the more self-service you can make things, the fewer engineers you have to pay for, because like the most expensive part of all of this is going to be your engineers. Your software developers are expensive. DevOps engineers are expensive. That's like a major cost saving. If you can have fewer people and you can pay fewer people, then you can do more cool things and invest more in your company's core competency and invest more in your actual product, not the things that make your product.
Got it. And so I think we addressed free lunch quite nicely. So I think what I heard there was, if it gets to a point where building it or having a solution that takes one dedicated resource, do you want a dedicated
Yeah, so yeah. Ooh. Is he back?
Oh, he's back.
Okay.
So question for both of you, Stephen, which is more important to you, time or cost?
I mean, there's obviously a trade-off there. I've been at the small company with 2 or 3 developers, and at that point in time, we definitely did not have any sort of budget to spend. But at Lessonly, we've got a team of 20 developers, and it's definitely worth us spending our money in places where we can make everybody more productive, right? If we don't have to have everybody waiting 20 minutes for a CI build because we can spend a little bit more on CI and get some more build machines, that it's definitely worth it. And the same thing on the CD portion of it. The less we have to have our engineers working on the kind of the less flashy portion of it that nobody sees, the more they can spend focusing on actually delivering customer value, then it's definitely makes sense to spend money on those tools.
And the way that I look at it is like it's not time versus money, because time is money. Like if I have an engineer that spends 3 hours working on something, there's a cost associated with those 3 hours. Everyone knows the phrase "time is money," So time is important to track, but you cannot ignore that time does cost you money. So that's where making that choice, what I was talking about earlier, of like how much time is your engineer taking to manage and maintain the system, how much is that system costing you? Even though Jenkins is free, it's not actually free. Going back to the free lunch thing, it's not actually free. Your engineers are costing you money to be able to manage and maintain and build and develop all of your pipelines.
Right, that's a good point. And so if we kind of summarize it, lessons learned, if you to do this all over again, what would be your top tips to DevOps practitioners like yourself? So if you to play back the last 2 years, what advice would you give?
So I think the time I spent at some smaller organizations made me a little bit shy from looking into options that cost money, and I definitely regret the amount of time I spent trying to run my own Jenkins server and running Spinnaker by myself. But I think that I definitely learned a lot in that process, so I'm not too upset about it. But I think definitely I wouldn't shy away from bringing up the budget conversation a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and I'm would definitely say the same thing as well. Like I'm very cost averse. I like to penny pinch wherever I can. I watch the AWS billing reports like a hawk, and try and find anywhere that I can make things cheaper. But I was like Harness is probably only the second like enterprise for cost tool that I've brought into our infrastructure, other than like obviously like AWS. I don't consider that to be an enterprise tool. That's a requirement almost.
Yeah.
And I probably would have been a little bit less averse to that cost, because in reality it's actually saved us money, because I've effectively gotten an engineer back.
Yeah. Anything you know now that you'd change? Like any hiccups, any challenges, any things you wish you'd done differently?
I mean, I would just going back to what I was saying earlier about making sure that you like compartmentalize your pipelines. It's not that I did something differently, but it's something that worked really, really well for us. Like I was talking earlier, the fact that we had a very clear delineation between where CI stopped and where CD started, that made like the whole transition to a different deployment tool very, very easy for us. So I would highly recommend, like there's a lot of people that don't really understand the difference between continuous integration and continuous deployment. And if you fall in that boat where you're not sure what we're talking about with CI and CD, like definitely read up on that and learn about it and know where that line is in your pipelines, because it's a pretty important distinction to make between like generating, and usually it's right around I've built an artifact, I'm deploying the artifact. That's the line. That's where it changes right there. Know where that line is and enforce that line. Don't let bits of your pipeline like live on both sides of that line. That is like a really critical bit if you want to maintain flexibility in the future.
Got it. All right, thanks for that. Let's get to the questions. So we got lots of questions lined up. Let's put questions on a plate. So a question from Nicholas: don't all tools have the same inherent flaw? If you use it wrong, then everything's unmaintainable. So I think the feeling here isn't just Harness the same as Jenkins and Circle CI?
I mean, I can field that one. Yeah, if any tool used incorrectly will do incorrect things. The difference between tools comes in how easy is it to use it correctly, and more importantly, how easy is it to use the tool incorrectly. It's very easy to do really suboptimal things in Jenkins because it's not a CD platform. I think the quote I used before is, when you install Jenkins, you get a web interface and an 85-year-old guy with gray hair. And then from there, you can build a CI system and you can build a CD system, but it's very easy to get that wrong. Whereas other tools like Spinnaker, Argo, Harness, they're more opinionated, and therefore it's more easy to get it right and not do those incorrect things. But yes, you're correct. If you do bad things will happen. That it's a tautology. It's just about how easy is it to do things right.
Yeah, I mean it's about using the right tool for the right job. You don't hammer in a screw, right? You've got a screwdriver for that. I mean, so try to make sure you've using the right thing for what you're doing.
Good question for Stephen. Can you debug pipelines live in Harness? Does it give you that visibility into the console and walk through the step-by-step execution?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of visibility into each step, and I've been very impressed with the ability to handle failures at different steps and different things that are where things are happening. There's a great visual layout of exactly how everything's executing and all the logs coming from each of the different steps that can happen. So it's been pretty easy to figure out why things aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, the visibility is definitely like it's top notch. It's really, really good.
Thanks. I'll pay you afterwards for that, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
So, question for both of you on security. What are you using to do security scans, vulnerability, static code analysis, anything like that in the pipeline?
Yeah, so you can go ahead, Stephen.
You go first.
Okay, so for us, we're using a combination of SonarQube and Twistlock. SonarQube does some static code analysis, but it's more focused around code quality. It'll pick up some security issues, but we're also using Twistlock, which is another like paid product that does more security-oriented static analysis of our artifacts. We're always interested in increasing our security posture, though. So we it's a never-ending cat and mouse game, right? Like what tools I'm using today does not necessarily reflect what tools I'll be using in 2 years, because the security landscape changes on a daily, if not hourly basis.
Yeah, we're using some static analysis tools. We've got a lot of Ruby, so things like Handbrake for static analysis and that type of thing, are there. And then, outside of the whole pipeline, we've got all sorts of other scanners happening with AWS Inspect and Tenable and all of those things as well.
Got it. Question. So from Simeon, when Jenkins is CI/CD itself, why do we need additional CI/CD tools?
So that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about like using the right tool for the right job. And Jenkins is, like, to be really clear, Jenkins is not a CI/CD platform. They say it is, but it's not. Jenkins is a framework with which you can build a CI/CD system. So it all comes down to how much time do you want to invest into Jenkins to build a CI/CD system. Can you do it? Yes. Can it work well? Yeah. Yeah, you can build a well-functioning CI/CD system in Jenkins. It's just a matter of how long is it going to take you to do that. And then anytime that you need to modify what you do as part of your CI and CD pipelines, how long is that modification going to take you? So going back to what Steven said earlier, it's not that one tool is bad. It's about using the right tool for the right job. A hammer is great. A screwdriver is great. One of them is clearly better for putting in a screw.
Yeah.
Hammer.
Of course.
It's more fun that way.
Question from Hamid. Stephen, what process are you using to build container image artifacts inside Jenkins pods inside Kubernetes?
We're just using Docker at this point to build the Docker build to build images.
Okay. If money was not an issue, what would you do? Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think right now, I'm happy with how everything's working. I think that the thing that I think we figured our CD solutions out pretty well. I think the next thing that we're looking at doing would be how do we optimize our CI portion of it, because that's our problem right now.
Yeah. Okay. I think that question is also a little bit flawed. It's not, because that kind of insinuates that you can make the situation better by just throwing money at the problem, and that's not the right way to think about it. It's not about how could I make it the best if I had all the money in the world. It's I have a problem, and how can I solve that problem? Very rarely does throwing money at a problem make it any better. It just makes the problem more expensive.
Good. So gentlemen, I think we're running out of time, so I'd just like to give a thank you to both Stephen and Chris for their time and knowledge. There'll be a recording. If any of you want to take a free trial of Harness, go to Harness.io, you can sign up. You don't have to speak to anyone. You can basically, we got a free version as well, so it's free for life. There is no how can I put it, clauses in that. You can deploy away. So with that, gentlemen, thanks once again. Yeah, look forward to doing it another time. Thank you.
All right. Great presentation, guys. Lots of great information. Before we do close things out, I do want to just quickly remind the audience that today's event has been recorded, so you will have the opportunity to watch it on demand if you missed any or all of it. We will be sending out an email after today's event that will include a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, before we close things out, I also did mention that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get that done. Our first winner today is Nicholas C. Congratulations, Nicholas. Second winner today is Christopher M. Christopher with a K. Christopher M. Congratulations, Christopher. Third winner today is Leandro M. Congratulations, Leandro. And our final winner today is Jennifer P. Congratulations, Jennifer. We'll be following up with all 4 of you offline by email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything there, check your spam folder. All right, guys, Steve, Stephen, and Chris, thank you all so much for a great presentation. I know the audience got a lot out of it, judging from the questions that came in. Really, really good, good and useful information. So thank you again for your time and your expertise, all 3 of you.
Thank you.
I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Bye.